The backstage hallway of the Fort Worth Convention Center in Texas was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of 30,000 voices raised in worship. But what was about to unfold in the next 60 seconds would shake the Christian world and bring one of its most influential evangelists to his knees. Kenneth Copeland stood near the stage entrance, adjusting his tie, unaware that his 55-year ministry was on the verge of being upended by a divine message delivered just 48 hours earlier. At the far end of the hallway, Jonathan Roumie, known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, sat with his head bowed, hands clenched, weighed down by a heavenly burden he could barely carry. The actor who had moved millions through his performance was now grappling with a revelation so daunting he had begged God to choose someone else. For 2 sleepless nights, Jonathan had wrestled with the message. A voice, clear and commanding, had echoed in his mind, "Tell Kenneth Copeland that his season of grand stages is over." The voice was undeniable, shaking him to his core. How could he, a mere actor, confront a legend like Copeland, whose believer's voice of victory broadcasts and faith conferences had reached millions worldwide? How could he say that God wanted him to abandon it all? The event coordinator's voice crackled through their earpieces. 60 seconds to stage. Gentlemen. Kenneth and Jonathan walked toward the entrance, the glow of the arena's lights spilling into the corridor. Kenneth glanced at Jonathan, noticing something off. The actor's hands trembled, his face pale as if he'd seen something unearthly. "You all right?" Jonathan Kenneth asked, his tone carrying the confidence of a man used to commanding thousands. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Jonathan lifted his eyes, locking them onto Kenneth's, his voice barely a whisper. "Pastor Copeland, what I'm about to say on that stage will be the hardest thing I've ever had to do. 2 days ago, Jesus spoke to me about you, specifically, and the message he gave me will challenge everything you believe about your calling." Kenneth's heart skipped a beat. In over 5 decades of preaching, he had seen countless miracles, people healed, lives transformed. But Jonathan's words sent a chill through him, stirring a rare unease. What kind of message, he asked, his voice betraying a hint of apprehension. Jonathan's eyes glistened as the stage lights beckoned them forward. "Pastor Copeland," Jonathan said, his voice trembling yet resolute, "God told me that in exactly 30 days from tonight, you'll receive a sign so undeniable it will force you to leave behind everything you've built, the broadcasts, the conferences, all of it to follow a path that will terrify you." The crowd roared as Pastor John Hagee's voice boomed through the speakers. "Please welcome Kenneth Copeland and Jonathan Roumie." The stage blazed under the spotlights, but the air between the 2 men crackled with tension. John Hagee smiled warmly at the audience, oblivious to the seismic spiritual moment about to unfold. "Tonight," Hagee began, "we're honored to hear from 2 men who've touched millions. Pastor Kenneth Copeland, who's led countless souls through his broadcasts and conferences for over 55 years, and Jonathan Roumie, who's brought Jesus closer to us through The Chosen." The applause faded, but Jonathan's hands still shook in his lap. Kenneth sensed the actor's unease, a growing intuition that something monumental was coming. Hagee turned to Jonathan with a simple question. "Jonathan, tell us how playing Jesus has impacted your faith." The question hung in the air, heavy and expectant. Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Kenneth. "Pastor Hagee, Pastor Copeland," he began, his voice weighted with divine burden. "What I'm about to share goes beyond anything I experienced filming The Chosen. 6 months ago, I thought I knew the line between acting and reality. But that line vanished when God started using me as a vessel for something I never asked for." The arena fell silent, 30,000 people hanging on his every word. Jonathan's voice dropped to a near whisper. Pastor Copeland, for the past year, I've had prophetic dreams about real people and real events. With details so precise, I've documented 20 instances where they came true exactly as I saw them. Kenneth leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He'd heard many claims of supernatural experiences in his decades of ministry, but the raw sincerity in Jonathan's voice felt different. 20 prophetic dreams, Kenneth asked, his tone a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Jonathan, that's no coincidence. Jonathan nodded, pulling a worn leather journal from his jacket. This holds every dream, every detail, every fulfillment, he said, his voice steady with conviction. But Pastor Copeland, nothing prepared me for what happened 2 nights ago. The air in the arena thickened. The production crew behind the scenes held their breath, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jonathan continued, his voice cracking with emotion. I was in my Dallas hotel room, praying after a long day of interviews about The Chosen's final season. I fell to my knees, exhausted, asking God why He chose me for these visions. And then it happened. The room filled with a presence so overwhelming I couldn't move. The air seemed to pulse, and I heard a voice speak with the authority of eternity itself. Kenneth's heart raced. He'd encountered the supernatural countless times, healings, prophecies, miracles, but this moment felt heavier, more urgent. What did the voice say? Jonathan, he asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Jonathan looked directly into Kenneth's eyes, tears streaming down his face. The voice said, My son, you've faithfully portrayed my earthly ministry. Now I have a new calling for you. There's a man named Kenneth Max Copeland, known to the world as Kenneth, who believes he's serving me through broadcasts and conferences. But his season of grand stages is over. I'm calling him to serve me in hidden sacrifice. The arena erupted in gasps. Kenneth's face drained of color. Kenneth Max Copeland was his full name, a detail known only to his family and closest friends. Jonathan, he stammered, his voice shaking. How could you know my full name? I haven't used it publicly in over 40 years. Jonathan pressed on, his voice growing stronger, as if fueled by the divine message. Pastor Copeland, the voice told me you've spent decades building a ministry that reaches millions through television and conferences. But God is about to call you away from the spotlight into a path that will demand everything you think defines you. Kenneth gripped the arms of his chair, his body trembling. This is impossible, he whispered. God doesn't dismantle a ministry touching millions. But deep in his spirit, a quiet voice stirred, hinting at a truth that could change his life forever. Jonathan paused, his eyes softening with compassion. The voice knew you'd say that. Pastor Copeland, it told me you'd struggle to believe because your mind can't grasp how God knows the deepest longings of your heart. It said to tell you about a private moment you had with Gloria 3 years ago in your study at home. You told her that despite all the miracles, something felt incomplete, like God was preparing you for a calling you couldn't yet see. Kenneth's breath caught. That conversation with Gloria, in the quiet of their Fort Worth home, was a moment of vulnerability he'd shared with no one else. Not his team, not his children, no one. How could you know that he whispered, his voice breaking with shock? I've never told anyone about that moment. Jonathan paused, his eyes still locked on Kenneth, as if weighing every word he was about to speak. The 30,000-strong crowd in the Fort Worth Convention Center sat in stunned silence. Kenneth's ragged breathing echoing through the sound system like a heartbeat of truth unfolding. Pastor Copeland, Jonathan continued, his voice trembling but resolute. God knew you'd say those exact words. He told me you'd doubt that your mind couldn't comprehend how he knows the deepest secrets of your heart, secrets you've never spoken aloud. Kenneth sat frozen, his hands gripping the chair, as if it were the only thing anchoring him. That private moment with Gloria 3 years ago, in their Fort Worth study, was a confession he'd buried deep. No one, not even his closest ministry team, knew of it. How could Jonathan, an actor he'd met only a handful of times, know such an intimate detail? Jonathan opened his worn leather journal, his fingers brushing over pages filled with scribbled notes. "God showed me something else about you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if revealing a truth that could shatter everything. 5 months ago, you had a dream that woke you in the middle of the night. You saw yourself in a small, dimly lit room with dirt walls. No stage, no microphones. Just a handful of strangers praying in a language you didn't understand. You felt closer to God than in any conference you've ever led. Kenneth's chest tightened. That dream. He'd woken at 2 a.m., sweating, praying for hours to understand its meaning. But he hadn't told a soul, not even Gloria. The dirt-walled room, the unfamiliar voices, the overwhelming sense of God's presence, it was too vivid, too real. "Jonathan," he whispered, his voice breaking, "how do you know about that dream? I never shared it with anyone." The arena remained hushed, the weight of the moment palpable. John Hagee, seated nearby, raised a hand to quiet the faint murmurs from the crowd. "Jonathan," he said, his voice reverent, "what you're describing goes beyond human knowledge. Only God could reveal such personal details." Jonathan nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "That's why I begged him to send someone else." But his voice was relentless, clearer each time it spoke. Kenneth's hands trembled violently, his mind reeling. He'd built Kenneth Copeland Ministries into a global force, with Believer's Voice of Victory reaching millions, conferences drawing thousands. He'd seen the lame walk, the blind see, lives transformed. Yet here was a young actor saying God wanted him to abandon it all. "Jonathan," Kenneth said, his voice a mix of anger and confusion, "if this is true, what does God want from me? I've given 55 years to his work. What could be bigger than a ministry reaching millions?" Jonathan took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for the hardest part of the message. "Pastor Copeland, God told me you're being called to leave the spotlights, the broadcasts, the conferences. He wants you to become a secret missionary, serving persecuted believers in places where they worship in shadows, hidden basements, abandoned warehouses, remote villages." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kenneth felt the ground shift beneath him. "Serve in shadows," he echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "I'm reaching millions through television, through conferences worldwide. How could ministering to a few in secret places matter more?" Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes filled with compassion but unwavering. "God knew you'd ask that," he said. "Kenneth measures his impact by the size of his audience, but I'm calling him to an impact that human eyes can't count. The persecuted believers in nations that forbid worship are crying out for someone like him, someone who's seen my power in its purest form to strengthen their faith." Kenneth shook his head, struggling to stay composed, but his hands shook uncontrollably. "Jonathan, my ministry employs thousands, reaches millions. Gloria and I built it from nothing. How can I walk away to minister to strangers in places where no one knows me?" His voice cracked, torn between defiance and a dawning realization. Jonathan didn't flinch. He turned a page in his journal, his voice carrying a divine authority. "God anticipated your resistance," he said. "Kenneth's identity is tied to his broadcasts and conferences, but I'm calling him to discover who he truly is by serving those who risk everything for me. He'll trade human applause for eternal purpose." Jonathan's words cut like a blade through Kenneth's heart. He wanted to argue, to call it absurd. But the dream from 5 months ago and the conversation with Gloria held him captive. "Jonathan," he said, his voice rising with a mix of fear and challenge. "You mentioned a sign in 30 days. What is it if God truly wants this? He owes me something undeniable." Jonathan closed his journal, setting it on his lap, and looked at Kenneth with a certainty that sent a shiver through the arena. "Pastor Copeland, God told me about the sign. In exactly 30 days, your granddaughter Lisa will call you with a story that will leave no room for doubt that this is his will." Kenneth's breath caught. Lisa, his granddaughter, was a successful interior designer in Dallas who'd always kept her distance from his ministry. She'd dismissed his conferences as religious theater during a heated family dinner years ago. "Lisa," Kenneth repeated, his voice thick with skepticism. "She doesn't believe in miracles or visions. She barely talks to me about faith." Jonathan nodded, his voice soft but piercing. "That's exactly why God chose her." He said, "I'll speak through the skeptic so the believer cannot doubt. In 30 days, Lisa will call you and describe a dream she had the night before. She'll see you in an old, crumbling warehouse, surrounded by people in tattered clothes, praying in a language she doesn't know. You'll share a brief message, and as you pray, an elderly man, deaf since childhood, will hear for the first time." The crowd erupted in murmurs of awe. Kenneth felt like he'd been struck. "A dream about me?" "In a warehouse?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear and disbelief. "And Lisa, who scoffs at my ministry, will see this." Jonathan nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "That's not all. In the dream, Lisa will hear you say a specific phrase before the miracle happens. Faith will carry you through the dark. She'll repeat it to you perfectly, though she doesn't know its significance. And what will leave you speechless is this: Lisa will say that seeing you in that warehouse, surrounded by those strangers, you looked happier than she's ever seen you, not on a stage, but in that hidden place." Kenneth's heart shattered, Lisa coming to faith. It was a prayer he and Gloria had carried for over a decade. He bowed his head, hands covering his face, trying to hold back the tears. But they spilled through his fingers. The arena remained silent, as if bearing witness to a sacred moment no one dared interrupt. John Hagee placed a hand on Kenneth's shoulder, his voice gentle but powerful. "Kenneth, what we're seeing is God's hand at work. No one could know these details unless he spoke them." Kenneth looked up, his eyes red, still grappling with the weight of it all. "Jonathan," he said, his voice breaking, "if this is true, if God wants me to abandon everything, what happens to my ministry, to Gloria, to the millions who depend on me?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes radiating a divine compassion that seemed to pierce Kenneth's turmoil. "Pastor Copeland," he said, his voice soft yet resolute, "God foresaw your fears about your ministry, about Gloria, about the millions who rely on you. He told me he will provide supernaturally for everyone who served faithfully in Kenneth Copeland Ministries. Those called to carry on the broadcasts and conferences will be guided to other anointed leaders. Those meant to follow you into this hidden mission will receive their own clear calling." Kenneth's hands trembled, still covering his face, tears slipping through his fingers. The weight of 55 years building a global ministry, Believer's Voice of Victory, the conferences, the countless lives touched, felt like it could collapse under this call. He wanted to argue, to demand more proof. But the dream from 5 months ago, the conversation with Gloria, and the prophecy about Lisa anchored him to an undeniable truth. The arena's 30,000 souls sat in reverent silence, as if sensing the sacredness of the moment. John Hagee, his hand still on Kenneth's shoulder, spoke with quiet authority. Kenneth, I know your heart is wrestling, but what Jonathan's sharing isn't human. This is God's will, calling you to a path only the strongest in faith can walk. Kenneth lifted his head, eyes red and glistening, his voice quivering as he met Jonathan's gaze. You're talking about Lisa, about a dream, about serving in shadows. Jonathan, I've spent 55 years building a ministry to shine God's light to millions. How can I believe that leaving it all for a few in hidden places is His plan? How do I know this isn't a test or a mistake? Jonathan knelt beside Kenneth, his hand resting gently on his shoulder, his voice steady with divine assurance. Pastor Copeland, God knew you'd feel this way. He said, Kenneth's ministry, every conference, every broadcast, every miracle was preparation for this moment. Every lesson of faith he's taught, every miracle he's witnessed, has equipped him for a mission that demands more trust than any stage ever could. Kenneth's breath hitched, a new wave of emotion rising, not just fear, but a faint spark of hope. He thought back to the early days with Gloria, preaching in small churches, driving a beat-up car, fueled only by faith that God was leading them. Was this call a return to that raw trust, but on a deeper, more daunting level? He looked out at the crowd, their faces a blur, then back at Jonathan. If I do this, he said, his voice shaky but resolute, if I leave everything to serve in these dark places, what happens to my legacy, to everything Gloria and I built? Jonathan stood, his voice now carrying the strength of a messenger fulfilling his purpose. God said, Kenneth's legacy isn't in the size of his audience or the reach of his broadcasts. It's in the faith he'll inspire in those who risk everything to worship me. He'll find his true legacy serving the least, in places no camera will ever see. The words pierced Kenneth like a revelation, both terrifying and liberating. He thought of the persecuted believers Jonathan described, people praying in secret, facing imprisonment or worse, yet holding fast to their faith. Could he be the one to bring them hope? Could he trade the spotlight for a mission only God would witness? The crowd stirred, sensing a shift in the air, as Kenneth's tears fell unchecked. He rose from his chair, legs unsteady but voice growing stronger. I don't know if I'm ready, he said, the microphone amplifying his raw honesty to the arena and millions watching worldwide. I've spent 55 years building a ministry I thought was God's will, but tonight, I'm seeing His will might be bigger than I ever dreamed. He turned to Jonathan, his eyes filled with gratitude and holy fear. Jonathan, 2 days ago, you received a vision you didn't want to carry. Tonight, I've been given a calling that scares me more than anything I've faced, but in 55 years, I've learned one thing: when God calls you to step out, you don't negotiate the destination. The crowd erupted in applause, but Kenneth raised a hand, silencing them. He took a deep breath, his voice steadying with conviction. In 30 days. If Lisa calls me and shares that dream about me in a warehouse, about the man who hears, about the words, faith will carry you through the dark, I'll know this moment was ordained by God. And when that day comes, I'll begin the journey of leaving the stage to follow Him into the shadows. Jonathan stood, tears streaming down his face, and embraced Kenneth tightly. Pastor Copeland, he said, his voice breaking with emotion, God told me that when you say yes to this calling, you'll discover that letting go of what you thought you needed will give you everything you never knew you wanted. John Hagee rose, his voice resonant with awe. Kenneth, what we've witnessed is faith that changes history, like Abraham leaving his home, like the disciples dropping their nets to follow Jesus. You're standing at the edge of a calling that demands everything. He turned to the crowd, his tone soaring. To everyone here and watching around the world, remember this night. Remember that God's plans are always greater than our comfort zones, always worth more than what we fear losing. Kenneth faced the audience, his eyes alight with a newfound resolve. Tonight, I came here as a preacher, certain of his path. I'm leaving as a man surrendered to the impossible. He turned to Jonathan, grasping his hand with deep gratitude. Thank you, Jonathan, for obeying God, even when it meant breaking my heart to rebuild it according to his design. The crowd rose to their feet, applause thundering through the arena, but Kenneth and Jonathan stood still, locked in a moment that felt like heaven itself was watching. Kenneth stepped back to the microphone, his voice clear and powerful. To every person here and watching at home, hold this night in your heart. God's plans for you may terrify you, may cost you everything you think defines you, but they'll lead you to a purpose you never knew you needed. As the cameras rolled, Kenneth stepped off the stage, his heart heavy yet strangely light. He knew that in 30 days. When Lisa's call came, he'd face the greatest decision of his life. But for the first time that night, he felt a quiet peace that the path ahead, though daunting, would be his greatest journey yet. Thank you for following this story. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If you'd like more inspiring stories about justice and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'll be back tomorrow with another must-see story you won't want to miss.